Claudia. I'm a self-proclaimed bookworm. My boyfriend, not so much. So I started summarizing entire books for him. Dramatic plot twists, romantic betrayals, magical quests, all of it. Basically, he gets the story without reading a single page. And now I'm doing the same for you. Welcome to The Whole Story, the channel where I read the book and then tell you the whole story, literally. Fantasy, romance, literary fiction. If it has yearning, magic, or emotional damage, I've got you covered. I'll tell you the whole story in 30 minutes or less, spoilers included. Yes, I will tell you who dies, who cries, and who should have just gone to therapy. So, if you like books, but you don't have the time to read all of them, or you just want to know what happens without the emotional labor, hit subscribe and let's write some endings together. Yeah, because life's too short to read 700 pages of slow burn, unless you're into it. I kinda am. Today it's going to be a little bit different. Instead of telling you the story of a full book, I'm actually just going to take a step back and talk about the different types of books that you can have. My boyfriend was asking the other day, what's the difference between fiction and literary fiction, or romance and paranormal romance? So I thought, okay, let's do this a little bit differently. So today we're going to talk about the different genres and subgenres of books. So to start, I think the biggest two types is fiction and nonfiction. Everything falls into one of these two genres and categories. And then you have a lot of different subgenres. So if we start with nonfiction, for example, is anything that is real, right? Or based in real facts and is not a made-up story. And inside nonfiction, you have a lot of different subgenres. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory, like cookbooks, travel, business, psychology, religion, So one of the most tricky ones, I would say, it's when you talk about biography versus autobiography versus memoir, for example. So biography is when someone else is telling the story of your life. So someone else is the writer, the author, and they are telling the story of your life, and they are the author in the book. An autobiography is, of course, when you are telling your own life story. This doesn't necessarily mean that you are the one that wrote everything. A lot of celebrities, sometimes they use ghostwriters. So they have someone that helps them, someone that is actually a professional, help them to do the writing. But it's an autobiography because they are the ones telling their own story and they are the author on the book. For autobiography, the example is The Diary of Anne Frank. She's the one that is the author and she's telling the story of her own life. When you talk about memoirs, for example, that is when you are telling your own life story, but you are focusing on a very specific period of your life or a specific set of experiences. So for example, and I'll give you examples as we go along. For example, Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. That is a volume in a set of autobiographies, but this specific book could be considered a memoir because it talks about a very specific period in her life. Then we have, of course, self-help and everything, but I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But then we move over to the biggest genre, which is fiction. So when we go to fiction, we have a lot of the subgenres. We have the main subgenres, right, that everyone knows about, which is just romance, thriller, or mystery, sci-fi, the standard ones. But there's a lot of different types inside each of these. So I'm going to give you some examples. I think the easiest one to start with is just fiction is a book that is based on fictional characters. It can be based on real events. Some of historical fiction, they actually take specific events that have happened, but then they make up a story. So the characters are not real, their names are not real. So that's what it means to be a fiction book. When we have romance, it is still a fiction, but in order to be categorized as a romance, it means that the love story is the main plot. So when we talk about different subgenres, they're all fake stories, right? But what is the most important element of the story? In a romance, it's the love story. And there are certain things that you have to follow when you're writing a book of this genre. So in a romance, it usually has start, middle, finish, or introduction, conflict, and resolution. And it's usually a happy ending. As an example for romance, we have Emily Henry, People We Meet on Vacation. When you go into different types of romance, you have historical romance, so it'd be the same thing but set in a specific period. Usually if it's a 90s story, or taking place during the wartime, but it's still about the romance and not about the war, then that would qualify as a historical romance. And then, of course, you have a lot of different types. You have like Twilight would be a paranormal romance because it's involving supernatural beings. Or you have romantic suspense, which is a romance where they combine it a little bit with the suspense and the thriller vibes, and that's what Colleen Hoover does a lot with like Verity, for example. Then we go into fantasy. That's a huge world of fantasy, and actually now we've been seeing a new subgenre coming up, which is Romantasy, which is a book where the romantic part of the story and the fantasy part of the story are 50-50. So they are equally as important. There is a very interesting post that I saw on Instagram where someone is talking about the fact that somehow all the Romantasy books are written by women and not men. And if it's written by men, then it's not called Romantasy, it's just called fantasy, and how this could be a marketing plot to get people, especially women, to buy more books because they're categorized and marketed as Romantasy. It's a very interesting read. But inside fantasy, we also have a lot of different categories. Fantasy itself means that stories that are taking place in imaginary worlds or that have supernatural elements. We have high fantasy, which is like epic tales that have like fully invented worlds. They're very complex. There's a lot of lore, and then of course, I think the biggest example is Lord of the Rings. That's high fantasy. It's like you really need to get into it. Then you have like urban fantasy, like City of Bones, for example, or like anything written by Cassandra Clare. You have dark fantasy as well, which combines fantasy with horror elements, or like has a grim tone, which is like The Witcher, for example. And then another big part is sci-fi. Everyone knows sci-fi. You have like a classic sci-fi. It can be hard sci-fi or soft sci-fi, depending on how much they go into the actual science part of it. My favorite example of that is Foundation by Isaac Asimov. Some people say that it was the first sci-fi book to be ever written, so it's quite interesting. It focuses on futuristic concepts, technology, alternate realities, and here we actually have a great example as well of Dune, this one. But it's actually, I found out that Dune is considered a space opera, which actually means it's a grand adventure that takes place in space and has romantic and dramatic conflicts and romance. So, you learn something new every day. So I think the biggest difference between sci-fi and dystopian is that sci-fi is very much focused on the technology, the science of it, very futuristic. Some books can be both sci-fi and dystopian, but what qualifies as dystopian is something that is really about a different type of future, a different type of reality from what we have now. So they're usually set on Earth, with the same type of reality that we live in now. So not so much fantastical things, but realistic things. It's someone just imagining a different type of future. And it's very interesting, like 1984, it's a dystopian, but it was written a long time ago, right? But it's still be considered a dystopia. One of my favorite examples of a dystopia is actually The Hunger Games, that most people know. That one is a very specific type of dystopia. There's others that are more utopia, right? Where they imagine a very nice future. I think The Hunger Games is not that, but moving on. Another big bucket would be horror, thriller, and mystery. These are actually three different types. They tend to be paired together because there's elements that kind of overlap within each other, but a mystery revolves around solving a crime or uncovering secrets, whereas a thriller, it's a high-paced, very filled with suspense. It doesn't necessarily need to have a mystery that you're solving. It could just be something that is happening, like very action-packed. And then a horror is made to create certain feelings within the reader. They want you to feel a specific way. Right, so for horror example, I have Dracula, right? Bram Stoker. That's a very good example of a horror story because it's really meant to scare you. Whereas a thriller, I have The Passengers by John Mars, which is very fast-paced. There's not really a big mystery there. It's just you can't put it down because there's so much happening and you keep being at the edge of your seat. And then mysteries, of course, you have like the Thursday Murder Club, which I think it's really funny. And you know that there's like a big mystery or several mysteries that you're trying to solve. Usually Agatha Christie's books also fall into this category. And you can be like a cozy mystery where it's kind of like, whodunit, or it can be like a hard-boiled mystery where it's really like intense. I do want to say that on thrillers as well, there's very different types of thrillers depending on what aspect the author is trying to make you think about. It could be a psychological thriller like The Silent Patient that we talked about already, where it's trying to make you think about what happens in people's heads and what makes them think. I think The Passengers could also be a psychological thriller. And then you have crime thriller, you have a political thriller, you have legal thriller. So there's a lot of different types. There's also a body thriller. Frankenstein is considered a body horror because it's meant to be scary and it's about the human body. So, you know, interesting stuff. To finish off, I just want to talk a little bit about young adult. I think this was a subgenre that was very popular a few years ago. You know, it came up with people like John Green that started to write a lot of YA, that's what it stands for, young adult. And then it became so big that it actually has its own set of subgenres within it. So you can have YA romance, YA fantasy, YA fiction, and you can have a lot of different types. But the common element is that it talks about someone who is a young adult. So usually people between 16 and 19 years old, that would be considered young adult. And then you also have new adult, which is a bit older. But there are certain things that are always present in these ones. It could also be a coming of age story, you know, coming of age, Catcher in the Rye, that's the best example I could find. And it focuses very much on a person who is going through a lot of different stages in their life and trying to understand who they are, where they belong, where is their life. So if it's that combined with a love story, then you would call that a YA romance. I have two more subgenres that I want to tell you about, and those are literary fiction and magical realism. I think like people have a harder time understanding these two. So magical realism, it's a fiction, right? But it blends in magical elements to the story. It doesn't mean that it's fantasy. It's still the real life. It's still the world that we live in, but they kind of tell the story in a different way. They use magical elements. They describe things a lot more, you know, instead of it's just birds flying in the sky, it's the birds flapping and the air moving around them is bringing the magic and the rainbow. So they really make it a full thing, and at some point they kind of turn the threshold between what's real and what's not real, and they can be dreaming, but at some point in the book you're gonna think, wait, is this real or not? And I think the best example for that is Murakami, Sputnik Sweetheart. For half of this book I couldn't really understand what was real and wasn't real, so that's a great example of magical realism. And finally, literary fiction. I think this one is very interesting because it is still a fiction, right? It's still made up characters, made up story. But instead of being plot driven, it is character driven, it's style driven. So it's not so much about how it started, so start, middle, and end, or introduction, conflict, and resolution. Most times there is no plot, there is no story that you're following. It's more about the characters, how they feel, how they are, what they think, how they transform. And there's also a really big focus on the literature. That's why it's called literary fiction. So it's about the words that you use, how beautiful the sentences are, how you put them together, and the feeling that you get while reading it, right? So I think a great example of that has been coming up in the last few years is Sally Rooney. As you might have heard of Normal People, she always writes literary fiction, for example. So it can end the book with, and then they went for coffee. And you're like, what do you mean? Like, there's no ending, there's no resolution. There's a few movies that do this as well, like Lost in Translation. So it's not for everybody. If you're the kind of person that needs the story to finish and to have an ending, I wouldn't recommend literary fiction because you're just going to be confused and you're just going to miss that closure that you're not getting. And I think that's it. Did we cover everything? Yes. And that's it. I hope that answered a few of your questions. I hope it's helpful. If you have any more questions, just write in the comments and I can always do a part 2 and go more into depth into a specific subgenre if that would be interesting, or give more examples. Or if you have a specific book and you don't know what kind it is, you know, just let me know and we'll talk about that.